17, APUS History, the Jacksonian Era. In our previous lessons, we discussed how during the antebellum period, the time period from the War of 1812 to the Civil War, we discussed how America had changed regionally and economically. Now we're going to look at some key political transformations, if we can. This is in many ways, this is called the age of Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian era, the Jacksonian age, or perhaps loosely phrased as the age of the common man. Now, what's that really mean? Why do we call it the age of the common man as historians? It's a kind of vernacular term that you can use for it. Well, as the age of the common man in a political sense, one of the first key elements you have here is the broadening of suffrage being the right to vote. Prior to the 1820s, 1830s, some states still had property or even religious requirements in some of the New England states for being the test of what was necessary to be able to vote. By the 1820s and 1830s, these have all gone away. So you're moving more towards an era of white universal manhood suffrage with no religious or property qualifications. So you've got a larger number of individuals embracing the franchise, the right to cast that ballot. Secondly, you have going along with this the demise of what was called King Caucus. What was originally taking place was in the past, party nominating conventions had been filled with party leaders who would then put forward the slate of candidates and pick from among those candidates to find the most, as they thought, the most proper people to run. Those are now being replaced in many ways by true nominating conventions where you're getting rank and file members of these parties and affiliated with these parties together in open rooms where they kind of debate and hash out the issue to get their slate of candidates forward. Campaigning during this time period and politics in general moves from the realm of the aristocracy to becoming a popular event. Remember from your lessons you've done earlier and your teachers have talked about, the first presidential cycles, no one campaigned. Washington didn't campaign. Adams truly didn't campaign. Elections were seen as being the province of the elites, and it was seen as being ungentlemanly to campaign. Instead of seeking out the office should seek you. That was the virtues of small r republicanism that came along with the founders. Once you've moved beyond the era of good feelings, though, we have moved into what you would consider sort of the emerging era of modern politics, where the office is something you seek and you actively pursue the office itself. In modern campaigns, as a popular event, bands, rallies, all sorts of events, publicity, flyers, pamphlets, the whole hoopla going along with it, banquets, dinners. Campaigning becomes part of the national culture in many ways. And along with this, you also have for the common man this concept of the spoils system and or rotation in office. You have during this time period a belief that it doesn't take any particular qualifications to hold a government job. Translation, anyone can be in a government job working for the government. So as such, if you take away this idea that you have to have a talented aristocracy or a bit more education or you have to be an expert to have a job, take that off the table, then any American citizen, any voting eligible American white male citizen can hold a job in government. And as such, you see politicians of this era viewing government positions and the fact that they can give these jobs to their supporters as being the lifeblood of party politics. That system begins to emerge, and to the victor goes the spoils, hence the phrase the spoils system. Those who won elections began releasing people that had government positions and filling those same government positions with their own party loyalists as rewards for that loyalty. Tied in with that was the notion of rotation in office, where if you got the belief that anyone can hold a government job, in order to get as many people from your party as possible a little piece of that action, you would rotate even among your own supporters, having them have jobs for a limited amount of a term, and then rotate through and have other party supporters, party partisans, take those positions as well, so that you could share that love, share that wealth with as many individuals who had been your party partisans and loyalists as possible. With the second American party system comes out of the era of good feelings. Remember the era of good feelings, we'd seen the Federalist Party as dead. Its British sympathies during the War of 1812 made it unpopular. After the war, we'd seen that under Jefferson and Madison, the Federalists, their best ideas have been co-opted and continued under the Democratic Republicans. And so as such, you had a party whereby there was really no need for a Federalist Party anymore. And for 8 years, we sort of run as a one-party state. Under James Monroe, there is the Democratic Republican Party, and that's it. However, by 1820, and certainly by 1824, there are factions within the Democratic Republican Party. It's simply impossible to keep all Americans under one political tent. We're too diverse of a nation politically, and you begin to have factions arise. Hence the election of 1824. In the election of 1824, you have this four-way race, and in this race, there was not Andrew Jackson as a candidate. We'll talk about him in a moment. Andrew Jackson as a candidate won more popular votes than anyone else. But in the Electoral College, that determines our president, as you recall. Remember, the founders built the government keeping the people removed from democracy to a certain degree, from direct election of the president. They would elect a slate of electors who would then do the picking. Well, in the Electoral College, because it was a four-way race, Jackson did not have a majority over 50% of electoral votes. So as such, the election gets thrown into the House of Representatives, where among the candidates that was out there was John Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford's the candidate, Henry Clay was the candidate as well, had nowhere near enough votes to win. Henry Clay is Speaker of the House. Henry Clay has nowhere near enough allies in the House to win. However, he can be kingmaker. Because he's Speaker of the House, he can shift and direct votes of his loyalists, and he can pick who the winner is going to be. After numerous ballots, John Adams becomes the winner because Henry Clay has his partisans, his loyalists in the House of Representatives, throw their votes in in the House, their presidential votes, towards John Adams and his candidacy. So even though Andrew Jackson had more people vote for him than anyone else, he's stuck holding the bag with nothing. And in exchange, or not in exchange, but shortly after winning the presidency, John Adams nominates that same Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. The Jacksonians cry bloody murder. They scream that this is a corrupt bargain, a dirty deal, which is to a certain extent unfair. After all, politics is the art of the deal. It's the art of making the possible take place, and that involves compromise. But if you lose out on that, the Jacksonians were livid. And Jackson famously sort of takes his toys and goes home. And he returns to Tennessee and begins assembling with some of his political operatives, Martin Van Buren, one of them, begins assembling the machinery and pieces of what will be the modern party system, creating the first truly sort of modern version of a political party, the Democratic Party, a party that was devised and built around the premise of winning and securing an election for its candidate or its slate of candidates. So in 1828, Jackson has his revenge after 4 years with his political operatives building this Democratic Party and sweeps into victory. He sweeps into victory on the language of the common man. Jackson himself, as you know, nicknamed Old Hickory, was self-made, never attended college, in many ways never left his emotions and his heart, his emotional baggage of the frontier. He was a rough and ready frontiersman, even though by the time he's running for office, he's very, very wealthy. He owns a big plantation, owns many slaves, but he still identified himself as a frontiersman and identified with frontiersmen, and the frontiersmen identified with him. And so as such, with Jackson's victory, this new common ethic comes in, and no longer is party politics the domain of an aristocratic elite of Alexander Hamilton's rich, well-born, and able. Instead, you've got something quite different. Now, Jackson, for his part, Jackson saw himself as carrying on Jefferson's legacies. Jefferson distrusted Jackson. Jefferson saw Jackson as something of a rube, a redneck, an angry populist with a dangerous temper, a sort of dangerous man who couldn't really be trusted. But Jackson, for his part, saw him carrying on the Jeffersonian tradition. And as such, it's important now to draw some lines and distinctions between Jacksonian and Jeffersonian views of the world in terms of their political philosophies, because there are some real divergences that become important. First of all, in terms of suffrage. Remember, Jefferson, for his part, felt that the property requirement was sort of important. He felt that anyone ought to have access to these things, but property meant that you had skin in the game. You had a stake in society. And as such, he thought that was a test of initiative, a test of character. By Jackson's time, this has been largely immaterial. It's been rendered moot. In terms of the chosen class, Jefferson believed in property holding is important because he said to be free, to truly be free, he said the freest people on earth were landowners. Not plantation guys, but small landowners, what he called the yeoman farmer, which was a small independent landowner who earned his living by the sweat of his own brow, making his own food, and was truly self-sufficient, so he was beholden to no one. Jefferson felt these people were the true backbone of the nation. Jackson, for his part, has expanded beyond this property model. Jackson sees the chosen class as being planters, like himself, but also farmers, laborers, merchants, mechanics, etc. The chosen class for Jackson was the working class, which was far broader than what Jefferson originally had. Now, when it came to their views of education, Jackson and Jefferson did have some significantly different viewpoints on the worth and importance of education. Jefferson felt that, remember from previous units, Jefferson felt that the common man was someone you could have faith in. The common man education could uplift and improve the common man. They could be aware, be made apprised and made aware of the issues of the day, and could vote intelligently and could be citizens who could contribute intelligently to their society because of that. Jackson, for his part, was a completely self-made man, had very little formal schooling, and as such, really did not place a whole lot of emphasis on education. He believed it was relatively unimportant. He said it was more important not what you were going to read and learn, but what you're going to do in life. You measure a man by their character of their actions. And Jackson was definitely a man of action in that regard. In terms of industrialization, remember, here's another big contrast. Jefferson feared industrialization. You remember back, he was against the world that he thought Alexander Hamilton was going to try to create, a world of commerce and finance. He thought that would lead to a slavery-like impoverished working class. Whereas Jackson, for his part, basically accepts industry as essential to the American economy. It's a fundamental part of our society, which makes sense if you extend Jackson's concept of the common man to include the working man, the artisan, the craftsman, the laborer, the industrial laborer, the mechanic, all those kinds of things. Jackson simply sees them doing their part, but in a different workplace than a farmer's field. Now, in terms of the Bank of the United States, here's an even more interesting contrast. Jefferson, for his part, always thought the bank was wrong, as you remember. He distrusted it, didn't like it, but when he had the chance as president to do away with it, he wound up keeping it. Why? Because the bank was working. It was making the United States solvent. It was helping us to pay down our debt. It was acting as an economic clearinghouse for financial and commercial activity. So Jefferson and the anti-federalists or Democratic Republicans after him, Madison as well, they kept the bank in existence. Jackson, as you well know, as we'll see in a couple slides, is going to make it his sole key political ambition or central political life's work to destroy the Bank of the United States. We'll discuss about why shortly. And in terms of internal improvements, the veto and state sovereignty, Jackson, for his part, feels that internal improvements are the responsibility of the state. They're not the responsibility of the national government for the most part. And his use of the veto, Jackson saw himself as the champion of the people, and the veto power should be used by him to reject legislation he saw as being unjust or wrong or favoring one region over another. And as such, Jackson will veto more pieces of legislation than all the other presidents before him combined. Jefferson was not nearly so active in the use of veto. He would have seen Jackson's use of veto powers being almost sort of imperious in its own way. And in terms of internal improvements, by the time you get to the era of good feelings, you do have national internal improvements that anti-federalist or Democratic Republican presidents had championed. The National Road begins getting constructed under Jefferson's protege Madison. And so we do see many of the best ideas of the old Federalists being co-opted by the Democratic Republicans during this time. Jackson is going to stand somewhat in opposition, though, as saying that is more of a localized matter. He'll veto the Maysville Road, which is going to go through only the state of Kentucky. He'll say that these are issues that need to limit themselves only to the state level and not quite have federal monies in them. So in terms of carrying on Jefferson's legacy, that was the narrative that Jackson pushed. But the conclusions on that from looking at their viewpoints are really quite inconclusive.